So this is the Kitsap Sun's editorial board. We're talking to the candidates for the 26th District House seat. We'll give you each 2 minutes to start, and Nathan, we'll let you go first. We'll go this way.
All right, great. Well, thank you all for inviting us to be here. I'm Nathan Schlicker, for those of you I haven't met, and I'm the former state senator and one of the candidates for the House this year. It's a real privilege to be here. In terms of my background, I'm actually a Bremerton native. I grew up here and now live in Gig Harbor with my wife. And we joke we're as much the 26th district as possible because my wife works in Port Orchard and we volunteer on the Key Pen, which are our major communities in the district. But you know, I had the privilege of serving the district for a year and thought I would go back to the way that I've been working in the community, which is as an ER doctor, caring for folks one-on-one. But as I did that, I saw the same reasons I had gotten involved. I saw the people struggling to get health care and the 52-year-old woman who dies of a heart attack because she never got her diabetes or blood pressure control, despite working every day of her life. You know, saw the parents struggling to get their kids' education and getting them to school and getting a job. And I just decided that it was time to come back. We've got tough decisions ahead, and we need hard work, and we need common sense back in Olympia. And unfortunately, we saw too much partisan fighting again, and not enough results. And with 3 kids that are going to start in our education system, I fundamentally believe that education is our paramount duty, that we need to fund it, reform it, and get them focused on the jobs of tomorrow while we also work on getting our teachers paid and the COLA that they've been missing out on for 6 years. And I know we need to promote our businesses here today. And we see in Bremerton one of those real challenges with the hospital moving and the potential impact that's going to have on our community. And I grew up in Bremerton and grew up in that hospital. Literally being born there, and it will be a sad thing to see it go if that is what happens. That comes because of economic decisions about placements of a mall and other impacts. So we have a lot of things that we can work on in economic development to promote our local businesses and our bases. I'm excited to work on that. It's time for Olympia to get back working for the citizens of the 26th district, and that's why I'm here.
Okay, thanks. Bill.
Yes, I'm Bill Scheidler, and originally from the Philadelphia area. My background's chemistry, and for the last number of years I've been an activist trying to help folks and reform the judicial and legal system in Washington State. The reason I'm seeking an office is because, quite frankly, the adage, if it isn't broke, don't fix it, means that I'm here because I think the system is broke. I think the legislature has lost its focus. I believe corruption, dishonesty, and deceit is what drives our political system. And I want to work to refocus our legislature back on the values of truth and honor, and the respect, and also to ensure that the legislature not only writes laws, but performs equally important, in fact, most important duty as a check and balance over the other branches of government, which I think they've failed miserably to do. And as far as all my other work, I'll leave that to, I'm pretty well noted on the internet. If you just Google my name, you'll find most of my history and background information. Thank you.
Thank you. One, I do appreciate the time today. So my name is Jesse Young. I'm your current state representative. I was appointed in January, and if I were to give you a background to who I am, I'm a father of 5 kids. I'm blessed to have been married for 16 years to my wife, Jennifer. Actually, I should say Jenny. She's going to see that and she's going to get mad at me. So, my wife has been a blessing to me. I've grown up in this area. I grew up in Tacoma. Met my wife in high school, and fortunately, having kind of grown up, kind of on the streets, I was homeless during my senior year. I've been able to make something of myself, and it's that type of opportunity that has kind of driven me to enter the political arena. I graduated valedictorian of my class, was appointed a Washington State Scholar by the state legislature in 1995, and was very blessed to have been accepted to the University of Notre Dame. And there are a couple of things that that experience still weighs on me, and that is, how about all the other kids that grew up the same way that I did, that didn't have that opportunity, and they're still kind of stuck into a low income mentality or situation that they can't really seem to get out of. I was fortunate enough to rise up out of that, and my kids are never going to know the want that I grew up with. They're not going to know the stress of wondering where they're going to lay their head the following night when they wake up, or where they're going to get their next meal. And I want to make sure that those opportunities exist for not just to allow someone to get a meal, but to also rise up out of that and change their stars, if you will, and be able to provide for their kids. And so with that kind of experience weighing on me, I then apply that and kind of juxtapose it to the professional experience that I have, which is I'm a software engineer. I've traveled the globe, both in Europe and Asia, consulting in industries that really are the future in job growth for this nation as we go forward. And it's one of those phrases I've kind of coined, jobs of the 21st century, to make sure that our kids have those opportunities for those jobs too. And I look at this industry and I see a bevy of those jobs going to foreign-based employees, whether they're in India or China. And if I can bring that professional skill set back and provide solutions to make sure that those jobs come here for our kids, then I think that I'll be doing a good job. And so that's the type of service that I want to bring.
Okay, thanks for that. First question before we get into like specific issues. So we always ask, you mentioned it, kind of partisanship down in Olympia. Bill, you kind of started talking about how the system is broken. Give me what you do, your personal experience, your makeup, your character, whatever it is that says, I can go down there, I can be someone who still gets things done, who doesn't just pick a side and vote with that side every time. Tell me why would a person believe you when you say something like that, when you say I can go down there and represent the entire 26th district, because that's one of our kind of a split district. It is, it's really mixed. We'll start with Bill, go Jesse, and Nathan this time.
All right, well, as I said, the last 2 years, I've done nothing but try to help people navigate a corrupt judicial system. I don't believe when something is blatantly dishonest and corrupt, you should pull punches. I believe you ought to call a spade and name it for what it is. And I think if people, and this in my view is the most important, people need to get the whole story, not just the headlines or the soundbite. I believe people, when they learn what's going on and how the system is actually corrupt or dysfunctional, I think they're smart enough to bring the pressure to bear. So I'm not so sure one individual can do it, but if one individual can express what needs to be done and who might be the people or the group or the entity or the labor union or whatever have you that's standing in the way, I think people will make their wishes known, and then we have to live with it. But I think it should be honest, forthright, and not deceptive. And I'd be happy with any decision as long as all of it is presented in an honest and forthright way.
Do you feel that members of the legislature are being deceptive?
I do. Everything is a euphemism for something to change the mindset. I believe it's all one-sided. I believe the focus is on creating a artificial Band-Aid to patch up the failures of their prior conduct. And if things like Common Core and growth management, these, in my opinion, are manufactured or test balloon Band-Aids to fix something that is a cause of mismanagement early on. So my focus would be to identify where the system is broken. And I don't think I could do that sitting here over a few minutes. I think that needs to be investigated thoroughly, but with the mindset that you look for those problems and then bring the information to the citizen and let them decide whether or not they're being deceived or misled or in some way sold a bill of goods. So,
Do you need to be in the legislature to do that?
you know what? That's a great question, and you should not have to be in the legislature. The problem is legislators don't listen to people anymore. They hear their problems and it dies on the vine, no matter how serious, no matter how significant.
All right, I'm going to come back to that one.
Yeah.
Well, I would say that there are a couple things to point to, and this is one of those questions that you really have to try to weed through and the political speak, if you will, and try to get down to brass tacks and some real facts as well, because everyone, I don't know of a politician that's ever come up and said that they're going to be completely partisan line and not listen to the constituents. Everyone tries to tell everyone, even you listening online to this video, they're going to try to advocate to you that, yeah, I'm going to be magnanimous and try to appease everyone or really give everyone's thoughts some heart and some real due consideration. So there's some facts. So when I was, number one, when I was appointed, I would note that I was unanimously appointed by the county commissioners, both Democrats and Republicans alike. And I believe the reason that they appointed me that way unanimously across party lines was because professionalism trumps politics. I think people are looking for real experience back down in Olympia. I'm not a career politician. I was appointed, I work in the software industry, or software technology industry. I'm a software engineer by trade. I have a business degree from the #1 business school in the country. And I think people want to see that type of experience applied through hard work. So, great, I've just given you a bunch of political speak, but what about actual facts? Well, facts state that in my time down in Olympia this year, I voted less than 85% of the time party line, which is a very big gap in terms of following your party line. Whereas my opponent over here on the left, when he was appointed in the Senate, voted over 96% of the time with his party or with Seattle Democrats. That's a fact-based differential. I'm willing to buck against my party, whether it was standing up, this paper wrote about, the homeless bill that was passed or trying to provide homeless funding. I actually voted against my caucus on that because I understand what it's like to be homeless. I'm not going to let my party politics or caucus debate sway me from trying to stand up for those that may be in need. That's one specific example. Then you have also my jobs bill that I submitted to the state legislature. That governor supported that. My Democratic seatmates signed on to that bill. I had other Democrats sign on to that bill as well because it was a real industry-specific bill that will bring technology jobs to this region. And again, it comes back to professionalism or experience trumps politics. There's another thing that's very important that we should probably note that's about the way Olympia is kind of formed with regard to the politicians that are down there right now, and that is there are not a lot of 21st century technology-based experience or skill sets in the representation down there. I'm one of the few that brings it. And the nice thing about technology is that there are not a lot of political battle lines drawn in that arena. So you really have an opportunity to reach across the aisle and say, hey, how can we work together on this bill that really, it's kind of uncharted territory? If we want to bring technology jobs here, what can we do to work together? And so, the bill that I put forward, that I submitted to bring technology jobs here, the very Democrat that killed that bill in committee was another one that we found ourselves working together on, hand in hand, on a technology bill that he was sponsoring that I helped write better. That was Representative Carlisle, who's a Seattle Democrat, and I was able to find a way to work on a bill that will protect people's data access rights for government records. And I was able to provide my experience and work with him to make that bill better. And so it's not about taking offense. I understand that party politics will happen. I'm in the minority. When I'm in the majority, at some point or next year when I'm reelected, if the people choose to have me, I'll submit that. I stood up for polls this year, and I did it vocally. The WEA and a lot of teachers found that refreshing, and I had an open door policy to them when it came to working on education matters and was not going to stick party line. I didn't promise the moon to anybody and say I'm going to raise taxes and give you everything that you want, but I showed them through sweat equity that I was willing to work by meeting with them consistently, meeting with teachers and educators in this district and going to the schools and understanding their technology needs, about how to implement some of these mandates that are coming down from the federal level. And when it comes to mandates, how about standing with teachers against federal mandates? I buck my caucus every time.
We'll be back to education in a second.
Thank you. Oh,
this way.
I didn't make sure you got it.
Well, I think my track record speaks for itself when it comes to bipartisanship. I started out my career working on health policy as a nonpartisan issue advocate, creating the ERS for Emergencies program. And one of the greatest compliments of my life came when I decided to run for the Senate appointment and talked with now Congressman Kilmer. He said, "I think you do a great job, Nathan. I worked with you on it. I just have one question. Are you a Democrat or a Republican?" Could never tell in all of our meetings. And that was because I look at issues, not at party politics, and have worked across the aisle time and again. In my time in the legislature, it's one thing to introduce a bill. It's another thing to get it passed. Despite being in the minority in one of the most contentious sessions in history, I got a number of bills passed, both ones that I prime sponsored as well as companions that I sponsored over in the House. I also worked to get a number of things done through the budget so that we helped keep the tolls down on the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, that we worked to address the ferries to make sure that they didn't end at 9 o'clock like the original plan was. I worked on mental health and closed one of the loopholes that was causing problems for folks. It's found stable funding to help address addiction issues and monitoring for prescription drug abuse. I worked on diabetes education and a number of other things. That's, I think, what is the reflection of bipartisan. It's not getting a Democratic or a Republican signature on a bill. I had 15 of those that had multiple co-sponsors, including leaders of the opposition party. It's what do you get done and what gets through, and how do you work a bill through the process that demonstrates your bipartisan nature? How do you work when a bill gets shot down for partisan reasons from the other side to make sure that the policy gets done in the budget? That's what I did, was deliver results, and I think that speaks to my bipartisanship. It's great to introduce a bill and get a few sponsors. It's another thing to get a bill passed.
Do you want to respond to the comment Jesse made about your voting with the party?
Sure, I'll happily get you the voting record from last year. This salacious political attack it was a standard bearer last year, and when we ran the numbers, in fact, I voted more like the Republicans than my opponent did last year. So it's just one of those tough things that, the data is the data. What I'll tell you is I've worked with both sides of the aisle, and I've worked on common sense solutions, and I'd happily talk about any issues rather than using faulty statistics. I would think, somebody who works in science would understand that.
So here are the numbers. WashingtonVotes.com, which is an advocacy group that counts all legislator votes. If you look at my 13 votes that I took, I bucked my caucus and voted with Democrats and other independents because I was representing this district. If you look at Nathan Schlicker's record, what you're going to see is 25 times out of 619 votes. That's all he ever voted. So that's 96% of the time he voted with Seattle liberals. He did not stand up for this district. When it comes to education or transportation packages, those are numbers. That's not faulty science. Those are factual numbers by an advocacy group. Now, when you look at that, I'm happy to stand up here and say I'm not trying to politically attack. I believe, number one, that you do care about this district. I believe that you see it a little bit differently than me, and I'm willing to stand up and say he's not a bad guy. I probably wouldn't take Bill's stance to say that some of these guys, come up here and they have an agenda. I believe that Nathan wants to bless this district just like I do. I see it a little bit differently than he does from a base starting point. But when I state facts and give you actual numbers that I just quoted on the camera for you, let's be real. That's not me being dirty or being political. That's just me trying to show that there is a difference between the two of us. I'm willing to vote more party line and buck my caucus because I'm going to stand up for this district and be an independent voice for it.
And I guess I would just encourage you to remember that the Democrats were not in control of the Senate when I was there, so it was voting on issues that were brought up by the Republican or majority coalition. Well, and one of the things I would just encourage you to keep in mind is that at times, Mr. Young, you also bucked both parties and were the only one that voted against the bill.
One time.
So,
and I'm happy to discuss it if you'd like to.
Now, let's get into another issue.
Well, he just made a statement that I don't think was fully true, and that is he noted that he's in the minority when he was there, but so am I. And yet I still found a way to vote less than 85% of the time with my caucus.
Right, no, hey, look, I think we've made that one clear on the numbers. And WashingtonVotes.org definitely is a good site. It's very easy to check, not only numbers, but it's actually better to, you can also see what it was they were voting on. I think that's something that our board looks at too. Both of you guys asked, education is the next one that I think you were kind of starting to go, and I cut you off because I wanted to get a more holistic statement from each one of you. Some good things happened last year in the budget process, getting some money set aside for education, funding the K-12 under McCleary, freezing higher ed tuition, things like that. Going to come up again when you start talking about the following 2-year budget, and obviously now the Supreme Court's saying some things that the legislature's not doing enough. We're going to try to push a little farther on that. Give me your opinion on how the legislature, how you respond to what the Supreme Court is saying right now, as well as how do we continue to find money to fully fund education, and maybe what that should look like. What would Jesse decide?
Okay. Well, I would note that regardless of where the Supreme Court of the state has come down, it is a constitutional mandate. And the reason why they've spoken to it was because of the state constitution saying that that is a prime function of the state legislators to fund education. And so from that standpoint, in honoring my oath that I've taken this office, which I take very seriously, we should find ways to fund it, and we should start to try to fund it first. You know, one of the core premises of this old notion that we're all taught as kids is actions speak louder than words is you should look at structures that put forth actions first rather than speak, because we've heard for years. While I was off consulting and providing for my family, I heard the state legislature over and over again say we're going to try to take care of funding for our education system, and it never really happened. Finally, the Supreme Court steps up and they haven't done it. You know, in the corporate world, if you're going to try to make a business run, or if you're going to try to make a small business run, you have to prioritize your spending and understand where your budget's going to be. So why wouldn't we fund education first and take the politics out of it? The fact of the matter is that politics does enter into funding education because of the fact that it's funded out of the operational budget, so it gets equal billing with other budgets that are being run, whether it's the transportation or the capital budget. Why don't we fund education first, put it off into a separate budget, fund it first, and then go fund the other things after politics is done? And imagine how the politics works. You've got every legislature appointed to different committees focused on their own agendas, and then what do you get? You get this mad rush right at the end where everybody has to try to compromise to get a budget. Focus everybody to fix education first, rather than waiting to the end of the session where we don't get any results done, and we have to have a special session, and everyone tries to stand up and says, well, I tried to support you. So number one, we should fund it first and apply really strong, proven business practices to funding education.
What does that mean?
Well, if you prioritize it first, then you're not going to...
No, I understand what prioritize first means.
Yeah.
You say apply really strong business practices to education. What does that mean?
Well, the first thing you would do is by allocating the budget to it, then you wouldn't have someone coming up and saying, well, I supported education, but then I voted against this, and all of a sudden you had different measures competing in the same bill. Number one, that way we'd have clarity as to where you really stood, whether or not you supported the COLAs, whether or not you didn't support COLAs. That would be number one. In terms of also providing practical experience to it, then you'd start to look at measures that come from the top down. We saw a number of legislative measures come down this year. One in particular that the WEA and the teachers were adamant against supporting, and you saw both Democrats and Republicans trying to figure out how they were going to vote on that, and ultimately we went against what the majority of Democrats wanted to do.
Teacher evaluations? That you're talking
The
about?
teacher evaluations. Yes, why? Because that federal mandate doesn't fit in a local model. The teachers are adamant that if you put this top, now what was the reason that they wanted this top-down mandate on teachers? Well, because they wanted a federal match of dollars.
A lot of money, yeah.
Well, it's a lot of money, but what good does that money do you if it creates a more ineffective system that costs us more in the long run? And more importantly, what if it hurts our kids, which is what the teachers say?
So you were opposed to that?
I was opposed to that, and I stood up for teachers in that regard. Now, it also comes to, well, where are you going to find the funding for it?
Right.
I actually stood with Hans Dungy, who's a Democrat out of Seattle, on his bill to actually allocate and make sure that no more monies get stripped out of lottery funds so that we can fund class size reduction for K-3 classrooms. Now, as a Republican, I was willing to stand for that bill because we need to fund it. I was also willing to stand up for the supplemental budget and the amendment that was added to that in the House that was stripped out in the Senate that would have funded teacher COLAs this year. Now, if we want to attract the best and get our kids the best education, we've got to make sure we have the best teachers here. And this notion that we're going to continue to push off every year for some political reason or another, not funding COLAs, I think is a horrible mistake. We need to give our teachers certainty with regard to their income and with regard to their ability to provide for their own families so that we keep and attract the best talent here.
Where's the place to look when you start talk about education funding first?
Yep.
Trade off somewhere.
Well, so for example, here's what happened in the legislature this year. The House passed a budget for $246 million, $249 million. That was the House's, their original budget for the operation budget. The Senate passed one for $105 million. Okay, when they ultimately came together and negotiated in committee an agreed upon solution, the agreed upon solution brought it up to 155 million. So that was the supplemental budget that was passed this year, was for an additional 155 million dollars. Here's a key note that most people don't talk about, and I notice most politicians aren't talking about it. And that is, of the 249 million, the line item in that budget out of the House, which was added by an amendment that I supported to fund teacher COLAs, was for about $50 million. Now, notice that when we went to committee, the Senate's original bill was only to fund additional education costs or supplemental budget costs, excuse me, by 105. They bumped up 50 million to 155 million. So what does that show you? That means that there was political will in the Senate to spend 50 million more. So why didn't we keep our COLAs then? Because in the backroom channels between the leadership of both the Republicans and the Democrats, they didn't have the political will to get it done, and they hid that fact by the very notion that education was hidden in the operational budget. But the numbers show that we could have convinced the Senate to come up 50 million because they did come up 50 million. And that 50 million could have gone to COLAs and funding our teachers.
What did it go to instead?
Well, let's go look at the budget. It was, they moved 50 million and went to a variety of things. And that's the problem. It's hard to say where it would have gone to because you got education mixed in with operational budgets. Why not add clarity to it and put its own budget for education so we can really see where legislators are coming down with regard to funding education? It's a critical need, and it adds clarity and oversight so that we don't have people talking politics trying to tell everybody, well, I supported your goal or your initiative, I supported your initiative, I supported your initiative and your initiative, and they speak in circles because they can, because everything's hidden into an operational budget. But if you want to be a successful business owner, you better have clarity with regard to where your expenses are going and where your prioritizations are. That's a simple business thing that we can do to add clarity to education funding.
So, education is a top priority of mine. I have 3 kids. They're going to start soon. How do we fix the system? Well, one thing we need to do is definitely fund it. But I think statements like fund it first are political doublespeak, because the reality is you can't just take money out of the operating budget and pretend like it doesn't come from somewhere else. And next year we're looking at roughly $2 billion we need to add over the current expenditures based upon the timeline that was set out by both parties. To do that, there's not many places to pull those dollars out of, and you heard again from my opponent a lack of willingness to identify where that was. We have to make serious choices and we have to make tough decisions. But we can't just continue to talk about funding education first and pull it out of the operating budget and pretend like that won't impact social services, hunger programs for kids, housing and education programs for kids. Those have real world impact. We're talking about just pulling them out and prioritizing it. I've heard some people analogize it to either a budget for a family or a budget for a business and say, well, you just, you get rid of the movie trips. But I'm sorry, healthcare is not the movie trips. And the Housing and Essential Need Program is not the movies. And the program to make sure that the aging, blind, and disabled is not the movies. I think that those are just horrific analogies that belittle those important things that matter to our constituents. I think we need to look at a number of things. We need to look at closing some of the outdated loopholes or incentives that no longer serve a purpose. If they're not promoting promoting economic development or new jobs, they shouldn't be there. And we should not be introducing new loopholes that don't meet those needs. So for instance, the bill that Mr. Young has talked about would do economic development in the IT sector, does nothing to require new jobs. No requirement to get
How much money do you think is available in loopholes?
It depends which loopholes we're talking about.
Yeah.
There's a couple hundred million.
The potential.
There's a couple $100 million, I think, is when we were looking at it in the Senate. I think the first draft of the budget has something like $500 million. But there's small ones like the fuel evaporation tax, which is one of my favorite. That's $5 million every biennium. But every nickel and dime counts in this conversation. And there are bigger ones that people talk about out-of-state business and out-of-state customers, and whether or not we should apply that only to border communities that have travel or as well as in our inner central part of Washington that allow folks to not pay sales tax. So those kind of conversations are ones that we should be looking at. And we may need to look at structural reform as well. There are savings that we can find through lean management. I've done it as an ER doctor, helped improve programs throughout it, and through savings like the ERs for Emergencies program. But they take thoughtful leadership, knowledge, and experience, And it's not just creating an artificial ranking system and drawing a line and cutting off everything below that line. It takes hard work, tough choices.
Jesse Young said he's supportive of the class size reduction, especially for the K through 3, putting some money there. You feel the same about that issue?
Strongly.
Where's it priority for you?
I think that when we look at education to fund it fully, it's prioritizing class size reduction, it's prioritizing our teacher COLAs, and it's getting the state to pay its share of transportation and so that local dollars can instead go to other programs in the communities rather than the state continuing to shirk that responsibility onto local
So
jurisdictions.
you guys kind of have similar priorities on those two. What about you, Bill?
All right, again, I'm approaching this from a different perspective. My perspective is the system is broken, and if you're gonna add layer and layer upon legislation or bills or whatever, it's still being managed by a broken a governance that is no longer honest and forthright with the people. And let me give you an example. With education, a few years back, I was asked by a board member of the South Kitsap School Board to be a member of the South Kitsap School District Budget Committee. At that time, the school district was floating a levy bill to be passed to fund education, and it was being defeated and in fact it was defeated 3 times back to back. So the school district asked me to come on, or this one board member asked me to come on to be on the budget committee, which I did. And we went through everything with a fine-tooth comb to find out where every dollar was being spent, how it was being spent, why it was being spent. And the decision was to conduct what was called a citizen forum or a workshop, so that anyone from the community could come in. We would group around tables, present all of this information to them, and let them decide how this money was to be allocated, and the consequence of what would be cut or what would be saved if this levy failed a 4th time. So after this workshop, then it was well attended, 300-400 people of the community came, and they all wrote down how to prioritize all of these line item budget things. And when we got back to discuss this, the budget committee with the board and the union reps, it was clear right from the start that the community had it exactly right. They prioritized everything in exactly the right way. However, the things that they put at the bottom of the list were the very things that impacted the union and the union members. And the union stood up and said that if this school district, if the board would cut those programs that were least wanted by the community, their union membership would be very upset. And what the school board did was they, instead of telling the public that these less important things would be cut if the levy failed, they said these most important things were going to be cut. They blackmailed the community.
So Bill, how does this explain what a legislator's job is in Olympia as far as figuring out what we're going to do to pay for schools in this state?
The problem isn't how to figure out how to pay for schools. The problem is how to pay for good teachers and get rid of bad teachers. You cannot continue to pay for underperformance and incompetence. And you cannot continue to pay for programs that are just a waste of money. So I'm all for rebuilding a foundation so that when we start to build upon it, it's not just trying to redesign to compensate for a previous flaw, which then creates another flaw that you have to now redesign to compensate for that flaw. Let's get governance back in check. Let's get accountability back in check. Let's get citizens back in charge instead of the Washington or the Education Association and all of these other unions who represent government public servants. And let me just finish. I looked at this claim that, we have to retain good teachers and we need more money to retain good teachers. And I learned that any time there is a vacancy or a school district advertises for a teaching position, they get thousands of resumes. So there is not a shortage of talent to fill teaching positions. So this whole myth that more money has to be pumped into the education system is a false argument. It just doesn't hold water, and my experiences bear that out.
Do you think teachers should get a raise or not?
No. I think teachers, the government, when they set a public service job, they announce what that job entails and how much it pays. And it's foreseeable. They have the GS or the salary charts that show how these salaries increase over a year. People know when they get a job, they see that. Okay? Why should they, once they get in the job, use their bargaining power as a group to leverage their power to sort of nullify the very conditions they accepted when they took the job? So no, I think the jobs are advertised properly, they're filled by applications, people want the job. Once they're in it, if they don't like it, let them find something in the public sector or the
You wanted
private.
to respond to something he said.
Well, education isn't an easy solution to come to. There are a lot of complexities in that arena. And one of the things, that there might be applicants for a mid-level or even an entry-level teacher position, but let's understand a couple points first. We're not talking about raises. We're talking about making sure they maintain their standard of living. Because they came in under the notion and under a certain collective bargaining agreement that said, I'm going to hire you in under these terms, and now the state legislature has changed those terms, which is not fair to teachers. Now, I agree with Bill on the prioritization piece. He hit the key point again. Is if we're going to prioritize it, then we can see really who lines up and who doesn't for teachers and education by separating out the budget. Political speak around saying it's not a budget or trying to make a political point that has no value, I think doesn't add any real solution to the conversation. But when it comes to actually funding teacher education, what about kids that are struggling with mental health issues? Those teachers aren't a dime a dozen. When you've got a teacher that has a career and bevy of experience helping kids that need a little bit of extra help, and all of a sudden you're making it almost impossible either through top-down legislation or indiscretion with regard to their income and not giving them a consistency to plan, how are they supposed to provide their best and innovate on behalf of our kids? Now, it also doesn't mean that by standing up for teachers and making sure that they're going to get their COLAs funded, that it's going to make you a tax and spend liberal. I think that the difference between my opponent and I just will be how we try to fund that. He mentioned that I didn't mention any alternative funding, but I did. I mentioned the lottery funds. And I mentioned standing up so that they don't get swept away so we fund class size reduction. But also, how about alternative sources of revenue rather than just saying we're going to close every loophole that's out there and hide behind the term loophole? How about actually saying that we're going to fund it with real solutions, like how about leveraging resources from our land? You know, if you look at other states that entered the Union at the same time that Washington State did, the federal ownership of their lands is like 5%. Yet in Washington State, the federal government owns 42% of our land. And they make pennies on the dollar relative to what state-owned property generates in terms of revenue that we could then dedicate strictly towards funding education and show the rest of the world how we can environmentally friendly leverage our natural resources in a way that the rest of the world can copy, but and be at the forefront of leading for those technology jobs, but also take fees from those by getting those exports going off of our shores, bringing foreign dollars in, and then tying that to education. Those are all alternative ways of bringing income into and revenue for supporting education that don't hurt our local business owners here.
Do you think that's a stable way to do things, to attach specific industries right to education? Because I mean, boom and bust kind of thing. If you said every aerospace is connected directly to education, someday that's going to go down.
Well, that's a fair question, but the alternative is what we've experienced now, which is where they say, well, we're just going to have some source of funding for something that maybe not as tied to an industry, but then what happens? Those funds get swept into the general budget, and then what happens? They get allocated someplace else, which is why, for example, when the state lottery was implemented, the funds from that were supposed to go to education. The reason why Hans Dunshee and the Democrats supported the bill, and a lot of Republicans supported it as well, and put forth a bill this year was because the legislature has taken that money and allocated it someplace else instead of leaving it for education. So it is a complex issue, and so you might say, well, maybe it's not better to tie it, but if you don't tie it, then what's going to happen? Another couple cycles down the road, we're going to be having the same conversation again, saying, what happened to the money that was tied to education? Well, sorry, it got swept. We had another need over here for transportation, maybe 520, or the big Bertha dig needs more money, so we had to take it from kids. Well, we're just going to do it for a little bit, but then another decade goes by, and our teachers still don't have the resources they need, and our kids are hurting.
Does any of the marijuana money go to education?
Right now, well, there's a big debate right now.
I can't quite remember.
And there's local municipalities, counties, and state level agencies that all want a piece of that pie,
Right.
and that's still up for debate in the House.
The original initiative does have money for education. The
It
question
did,
is
it did.
how much is
Okay,
actually going to come
that's not
in.
decided how
That's
much.
still a little hazy,
okay.
the
A
revenue
lot of
side of
people,
it.
any new revenue that comes up,
Come on,
they want their piece of their pie, and so
Do you think? Let's ask that question. I mean, is this something that they talked about? Do you think a portion of the? Because this is probably a great example. This is a truly new industry.
Yeah.
Assumably, this is new dollars coming into the state. Should some of that money, should it go directly to education? Is that? I mean, this is what you're talking about, right? Would you be in favor of something like that?
I would be. I'm not opposed to allocating money that way to fund education, especially given the McCleary decision. At the same time, you do have competing interests. You have police officers that want that. The police community really does want some additional revenue to come in to help them
Right. They have to be.
Deal with the challenges.
deal with the challenges.
But I think all of these things that we're talking about here, whether it's through economic growth, which is a piece of it, we definitely need to grow our way out of this recession. There's no argument. But that's a slow progress over time. It's not going to overnight fund $2 billion that need in education. So we should be working on that, but in the parallel, we can't wait for that to happen. A, because it's not the right thing for our kids, but B, because the Supreme Court has made it rather clear that they're not going to wait around for the state to grow their way out of this problem. So, economic growth is a piece of it. But, relying on the marijuana revenue is equally problematic because OFM can't book it right now. So it just pragmatically, but yes, some of it should go to education. And when we talk about lottery funds, let's remember the amount of dollars in the lottery funds is not even close to $2 billion in its entirety right now. I believe, if I remember correctly, it's $530 million last year, roughly. And a large chunk of that does go to education. It just doesn't go to K-12 education as well. It goes to Washington Scholar Programs and other higher ed issues. So, there's money to be moved there. There's no argument. But again, every time you talk about moving funds, you're taking it from something else. You're taking it from a program that does have real world impacts. And it would be really nice when we talk about moving funds and prioritizing education to at least identify what you're willing to cut. To just say, we'll put a list together and draw a line. That's how we got to a budget last year when we were putting $1 billion into education that took money from drug and alcohol treatment programs. It reached into the patient receivable coffers at the University of Washington, just took $12 million out of their budget. I mean, that's not even state dollars, most people would argue. Led to a whole bunch of goofy things, led to capital fund transfers out. Those are not long-term viable solutions. And when you're just moving funds around and pretending like there isn't a consequence, that's not leadership. If we're going to identify tough decisions, if we're going to identify solutions, we need to actually identify what those are.
Yeah, but you haven't listed a single one yet, which I find very interesting. You keep saying, well, we can cut loopholes and maybe find miracle money there, but which businesses are you going to deprioritize and which industries are you going to hurt? The small mom and pop stores that are supporting their families by closing all these loopholes. Can you name a few?
I already have actually. I identified the fuel vapor tax that was $5 million. I've talked to you about.
And so
the
all of our
issue.
movers, all of the moving
Hold on,
industry
let him-
around here that are going to pay an
No,
additional
let him-
tax,
Let him answer.
they're not going to go out of business?
We can't debate every single one of them, but you asked for a couple examples.
You
Let's
asked
hear
for
a couple examples.
If you want a couple of examples, the second one, a lot of people have looked at the issue of out-of-state residents and the collection of sales tax, which is critical for our border communities. There's no argument. But when we have Seattle, which is a travel hub, for instance, my profession, the American College of Emergency Physicians, hosted our conference here in Seattle and brought 6,000 physicians and their families here. Yet in theory, almost all those people could qualify for an out-of-state exemption to some of the sales tax. Does it make sense in Seattle that's being used as a different destination than supporting those mom and pop stores on the border community, which we need to do? There is a difference there. And do we look at separating those things and keeping it where that dollar is needed? Do we look at other issues that have to do with, hog fuel tax? There are a number of different options here. But the one thing I think we can all agree on is creating new exemptions that don't do economic development and don't promote new job growth and target an industry doesn't make sense, especially when that industry has a gap in skilled workers and basically every dollar you're pulling out of that is taken away from education.
Hold on, let's just make this one clear, just so everyone understands what we're talking about. You were criticizing a bill that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, he's criticizing the bill
regarding technology. Is that true?
Yes, it's a bill.
Why is it something that doesn't work?
It's something that doesn't work because it gives an 80% tax cut to IT businesses in naval counties, or counties with a naval base,
Okay.
that is not tied to a single job growth. There's lots of good economic bills that talk about giving a B&O tax exemption or credit to small businesses that hire somebody new, so that then when they're on that border, they get a $5,000 B&O tax credit. I supported that as a senator. Those are the type of programs that we need to do that promote economic development. Just giving, an 80% cut to one industry, not tied to economic development and not tied to growth, doesn't make sense, especially when right now every dollar is going to education. And in the IT industry, as I'm sure Mr. Young will agree, there's upwards of $1 million or 1 million jobs that we're going to be short by the end of this decade. You're taking money out of the thing that we need to get skilled workers into an area and putting it instead into tax cuts for businesses. And what's more problematic is that this is sold as economic development. Yet when you poll businesses over and over again, the number one thing they look at when they look at where to site a company, education. We should be supporting IT program development at Olympic College and putting our money into the education system.
Can you give us a background on
Oh,
that?
yeah, absolutely. I would note that this is where you have experience versus inexperience. Him speaking to IT and that industry, and specifically the IT service sector industry, which he didn't correctly label, which is where the bill was targeted, is like me trying to explain to him how to perform a procedure in an operating room. I wouldn't attempt to do it, but I think he should give some difference to someone that has real world experience there, because the truth is, we did a fiscal note, and for those that don't know what a fiscal note is, a fiscal note studies the impact to tax revenues that we will receive as a result of implementing this tax benefit or preferential treatment to these types of industries. The fiscal note for Kitsap County was less than $243,000, which number one tells you that those jobs don't exist in Kitsap County. So this isn't providing a loophole to existing businesses. This is about attracting new businesses. Now, having experience in this industry, I can tell you a couple things. Number one, in California, there's technically a hiring freeze for these types of industries, or for these types of jobs in the IT service sector arena. The reason why is because the business climate, as we all know, is very hostile towards businesses. And more importantly, in this industry, a lot of these types of jobs, six-figure, good-paying jobs, are project-based. And when they're project-based, that means you have a ramp up and then you have a ramp down, and there's potential intervals between when people can get those jobs. And California's business climate does not support that. 2.5 weeks into me being appointed into the state legislature, the healthcare provider that I consult into, Kaiser Permanente, laid off 1,000 contractors. 1,000. 95% of those jobs, they still needed the output of the work that those contractors were doing. 95% of that work went over to India. If we'd had our bill here, that would have made these jobs more competitive to come to our district. That's 1,000 six-figure paying jobs that could have come here.
What exactly does the bill do?
The bill provides a B&O tax preferential treatment to any IT service sector job that relocates relocates either their headquarters or provides those types of IT service sector
It has
jobs
to
here.
be a new business.
New business, but
So
the business
Kaiser
here doesn't
Permanente
exist. And
was on-
understand what we're trying to do here. Bremerton, and specifically with their SKIA initiative, Tacoma, and then the offshoot from Tacoma, which has come over the Narrows Bridge and provided additional infrastructure in the Gig Harbor. a number of years ago, over the past couple of decades, they have worked to lay a lot of fiber optic cable into the ground. So we have a sunk cost in terms of IT infrastructure investment that's been made in these communities, but we're not fully utilizing the bandwidth in that arena. This bill will take advantage of that. I'm an example of that type of job. I spend time down in California, but when I'm not there, even like today before I came here, I was doing my job from home. Why? Because I have the bandwidth to do it, because the infrastructure was already laid in the ground for me to do it. So I can do database processing from my home. Why? Because the fiber is there. So I looked at that and I said, there's an infrastructure investment that's already been made. Are we just going to let it rot in the ground, or are we going to try to find a way to leverage that to provide more jobs here for people that can work out of their home? And keep in mind the economic beneficial impact that can have to this district. Because my commute goes from my bedroom to my office and my home road. So I'm not clogging the roadways. Yet when I go to buy groceries for my 5 kids, I'm producing a lot of tax revenue for this district. Those are the types of jobs that we want to bring here. It's the types of jobs that help provide jobs for women. It's the types of jobs that couple with Olympic College and with TCC that are in our district.
But it would have to be a new business opens and then they get the B&O.
No.
What if you're a business and...
No, I'm just trying to clarify. I'm sorry.
Well, what if, okay, so there are 2 areas in this regard too. You have white collar jobs like I perform, and then you have blue collar jobs, because the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard supports a lot of ancillary businesses. And yesterday's mechanic is today's technician. Yesterday's mechanic may have swung a wrench, but today's mechanic is programming that wrench with specific parameters to perform the jobs that they want to do.
Right, you're explaining that.
And,
I'm just trying to understand the bill. I'm sorry.
yeah. Well, if you located those jobs here,
okay,
then you apply for that. You
I
could
would have
apply
to
for
start
that
a new
tax
company
preferential
and
treatment.
if it's-
And so your
No,
gross
no.
revenues.
It's any company located here. Doesn't require new relocation. That's an important piece.
If you bring those jobs here, do we want the jobs here or not? I want my kids to have an opportunity for those jobs. I want your kids to have an opportunity for those jobs. Those jobs don't exist in this district.
it's giving communities with a naval base.
Yeah, we tied it to
advantage
naval
over
base.
the next
Here's
county.
why we did it
That's
that
what
way.
we're doing.
Those jobs could potentially go over to Bellevue, but look at the infrastructure problems that we're having over in Bellevue and King County. We have capacity here for those jobs, and this job specifically targets a strategic benefit of this district with regard to our fiber optic cable. More importantly, it also plays to the advantages of this district with regard to its geography. It's perfectly triangulated between Seattle and Tacoma in terms of business hubs to provide an offshoot for you to come live over here, not clog the roadways over there. So as a legislature, I don't have to come to you and say, I want to take money out of your pocket to go fund another transportation package in King County. Because I'm bringing those jobs here, you don't have to commute there
Okay,
anymore.
thank you.
Just to clarify, 1, it doesn't require new jobs. That's been identified. 2, there are jobs here because you identified a $243,000 fiscal note.
That's low. Those jobs don't exist here.
There's an argument for increased growth. There's no argument there, but the issue is, do we give tax breaks without a requirement that there be job growth when we're dealing with challenges in funding education? If you want to talk about, scoping your bill down to actually do job growth, that'd be a different conversation. But, I don't think that's what your bill does. That's not what the impact is. And again, if we're looking at what draws companies in all industries, not just IT, it's education. If you look at most surveys of employers, the tax regulatory environment is about 5th to 7th on most of them. It is one of those things that education is paramount duty, and when we're struggling to recruit folks to our area, we need to look at education and funding that and addressing it. The second thing they look at, again, is infrastructure issues. And again, IT is one industry, but when we're talking about the SKIA development, we're talking about hopefully building a Frederickson over here, being able to do carbon fiber and other industrial jobs that need to get to market, that we need to address infrastructure issues. So I think we need a more holistic approach to economic development than tying ourselves to one industry that doesn't necessarily require any job growth.
All right, Roger had a question. I want to let him get.
Yeah, I've got one thing. Sort of not really off track, but taxpayer for over 30 years, South Kitsap. One of the things that's happened is I get this little bill in the mail from the county and my taxes, specifically things like levies. Now, one thing the fine legislature's done over the last 10 years, instead of taking responsibility in funding education, instead pushed it on taxpayers by increasing the percentage of levies. How do you feel about that, and what are you going to do to stop that and reverse that issue? It's your responsibility for education in the legislature, but yet you still push it on to the taxpayers to support levies. Levies shouldn't be for the 95% of it going to the wages for the teachers. That should be your responsibility. How do you fix that? What do you see of changing that in the future?
Agreed, that's where funding education by the state is required. You know, when I was in the Senate, we put $1 billion in. It was a start. We've got to put another $2 billion in. That's through closing loopholes. It is possibly for moving some lottery money, and it's possibly looking at other solutions about economic growth and development, partnerships, et cetera. There's no easy solution to that. I don't begin to minimize the nature and the scope of the problem that has been built up through years and years of fiscal problems, the Great Recession, and just poor economic policy down in Olympia. It's going to be a challenge, there's no argument. But everybody, I think, agrees that levies are not the solutions, and they should go towards things like after-school activities and all those things that I remember when my mom sat on the finance committee for Central Kitsap, you know, looking at these things as they were looking at what they cut in levies. They were talking about cutting after-school programs. Here we're now talking about cutting teachers and about other major services. We're at this point now where the legislature can't keep kicking the can down the road. And if we're not going to talk about real solutions, we're not going to have honest conversations about what those cuts are, if we're going with an all-cuts approach, then we've got real problems. Many people are going to work across the aisle, and that's, you know, what I've done and what I'll keep doing.
First of all, the levies basically don't go for core educational programs. They go for all of the contract negotiated programs that the unions negotiate with the school districts. So this levy that is being passed is basically because the unions pressure the boards to give them a whole bunch of benefits and money, and that is what the levy money goes to. Second of all, just to ask a couple of questions, hypothetical questions or rhetorical questions to approach in relation to these, to what is obvious from their discussion. I would look back and say this: if 5 years ago we implemented charter schools or vouchers, where would we now be in a problem that we are now in a budget crisis? What mistakes, what did we do wrong early on to bring about this crisis? If we always just simply try to manufacture or do a test program to see if we can fix something that has been a result of poor management early on, let's take a look at what effect would we have today if vouchers would have been in place, if charter schools would have been in place, if this or that. I would work backwards to find out why we are in a crisis, rather than to continue to layer more bills, more legislation on the same bunch of people who clearly mismanaged early on to bring us to the crisis level today. So that is my question: is where would we be if vouchers would have been in place five years ago, 10 years ago? Do you have any answer to that?
Well, I think, your question about the overall economic challenges, part of it is the Great Recession, our transition from a brick and mortar economy to an online economy. If you look at the percentage of state GDP that the state collects, we peaked around 2000 about 7.5%, and we're down to about 5.5%. So a lot of it has to do with our overall flawed revenue picture. As to the local issue, the challenge bill that I've always seen with this conversation about this dollar goes to that program is that, the reality is it's one budget and one revenue stream. There's not a dollar designated for this, and so when we say, the levies go to a union program, that's not really true. They're all funded together, and we're making priorities. You can pick whichever one you want it to do, but unless it's a capital construction project, like we have down in the Peninsula School District where, we both are in Gig Harbor, where it's actually building a school, it's hard to say exactly what dollar goes to which. And so that's the two things I think. But, there are arguments to be made that voters have chosen to do charter schools, and we're going to see how that experiment works. Some states have had great success, some have not, and we'll see how Washington does.
Let's let Jesse take the levy question.
Well, yeah, so I guess I'll address 3 points. I think number one, with regard to your specific question about levies, I think it's important that we understand when we saw the uptake in those. And then we'll speak to one of the solutions that I've already supported and will continue to try to support. Because we do need to bring additional sources of revenue into the picture here. And the state had a working model at one point. And you'll notice that, again, a lot of schools and a lot of the funding for schools came from revenue that was generated by state-owned land. And specifically, some of that came from the forestry industry. And then we saw that what happened with the spotted owl after that came into effect. And you saw a lot of the state-owned land shut down with regard to logging and the production there. And again, we've come back and science has shown it wasn't the logging industry that was hurting the spotted